I'm Robert Lieber. I'm chair of the executive committee for the program on Jewish civilization. Let me also say that this event is also co-sponsored by Tom Bonshoff's outfit, the program on religion, politics, and peace, and we appreciate their support as well, as also that of the School of Foreign Service. Let me introduce Nancy Sherman. She is a professor of philosophy, and while some would say a person who at Georgetown needs no introduction, having been the recipient of that sort of thing, I always say, wait a minute, everybody deserves an introduction. Nancy is also adjunct professor of law at the Georgetown Law School. In 1997-99, she served as the inaugural holder of the Distinguished Chair in Ethics at the United States Naval Academy, and she is the author of this book, which we'll be talking about today, Stoic Warriors, the Ancient Philosophy Behind the Military Mind, and she is also author of several other important books. She has been previously an associate professor of philosophy at Yale and has held visiting positions at Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland. She's also written over 30 published articles in the general area of ethics, the history of moral philosophy, ancient philosophy, military ethics, moral psychology, and the emotions. She has been the recipient of some of the most prestigious awards in the field, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Philosophical Society, the Mellon Foundation, and the Charlotte Newcomb Fellowship of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. She holds a Ph.D. from Harvard in philosophy and M.Litt from the University of Edinburgh, and received her B.A. magna cum laude from Bryn Mawr College. It's a great pleasure to introduce Nancy Sherman. Nancy.
Thank you very much. Thank you for taking time on this rainy day, and I also have to say what a great pleasure it is to be part of the steering committee of the program, that outfit. We're trying to be a center, but we're a program for Jewish civilization, and it really has, I think, brought a lot of interesting people together, and look forward to hearing your talks as well, and I've heard some last year, which I so enjoyed. I gave you a handout, and I want to say that I will speak to some of the general issues. I was billed as planning to speak, but that I was asked to do that in June, so my thoughts shifted a little bit as I prepared for this talk. Let me give you a little background to this book, Stoic Warriors, and then tell you how it's going to tie in with Judaica. The book's about sucking it up, about stiff upper lip if you're a Brit, tough it out. And it is about military culture by and large, but it's not only military culture. Military culture knows well and loves Stoic ethos, but so do many of us in adversarial times especially. So it's about those who wear the uniform, but also many of us who don't. And I came to learn this mantra, suck it up, when I was at the Naval Academy. As Bob said, I was there in the late 90s as the first chair in ethics. They hadn't taught ethics. They thought it was some newfangled subject. You know? They taught leadership courses, but not ethics, like West Point, but not like Air Force. They decided to teach ethics in the wake of a cheating scandal. And so I was the person called in. It was called the Double E scandal, electrical engineering, big compromise. And so they kind of dragged their heels in learning ethics, in the sense of thinking that the subject should be taught like a course. They thought it should be bred in the bones, or taught at synagogue or church or in the family, but not necessarily at university. They were more familiar with leadership courses or psychology motivation courses, something like that. But when they did resonate to the topic, and I'm talking about both my students and my officers, I taught with colonels and admirals, Navy captains, so 05, 06 level officers. When they resonated was when we came to the historical subject of Stoicism. And I had them read Epictetus, who's a first century Common Era writer And this was their philosophy, because it was about how you deal with deprivation, how you deal with, whoops, journal through how you deal with lack of liberty, how you deal with hardship. And it is about empowerment, empowering yourself in the face of external constrictions of your freedom. And this seemed to be their story, their own story. As many would say, I can't control my deployment times, I can't control if I'm going to make it home to see a child born or make it home for my wedding, one of my naval commanders said, but I can control how I conduct myself as an officer, assuming the well, this is a theoretical aside I'll put out there, assuming the cause of the war is just, but many will say you can have just conduct. Walzer in particular, you can have just conduct independent of the cause of the war, just cause of the war. So what I wanted to do in the book was take more seriously this resonance of popular Stoicism with ancient Stoicism. And I look at this cast of characters, the Greeks, not really household names, one of the many Zenos in the ancient world, Zeno of Citium, and then there's Chrysippus and Cleanthes, and then more familiar names like Cicero is a great transmitter of Stoic texts, but also there is Epictetus, and before him Seneca. You have to understand, Seneca is really a public figure in Roman life. He's the spin doctor, publicist, philosopher, advisor to Nero, constantly urging Nero to temper down the anger and try out a little mercy. In fact, writes a book on clemency for De Clementia for him to take note of. And also Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations were written on the shores of the Danube during the Germanic invasion, so very much a practitioner, philosopher. His meditations meant for private reading only, but many consume it. Just an aside, one of our steering board members, David Lubon, was giving a talk at West Point last year, and I just finished the manuscript, and he said, Nancy, you'll never believe this. I was in a car with a guy, and I confessed that I teach philosophy, said David. And he's at the law school teaching philosophy, and this guy said, well, I never have time for reading philosophy, it's not my thing, but I do read, I read Epictetus 8 times a year and Marcus Aurelius about 5 times. So, and others, I just was interviewing some young 25-year-old just returned from Iraq who says he reads Marcus Aurelius regularly. Clinton was said to have read it twice a year. So the Roman Stoics are more popular and accessible. Indeed, it was the public philosophy at the time. Now, I decided in thinking about this to bring to bear someone I know very little about, but have always wanted the opportunity to learn something about, and that's Philo. So Philo of Alexandria, or Philo Judaeus, is a 1st century Jewish writer, totally Hellenized, unclear how much Hebrew he knew, but he knew lots of Greek, very much raised in Greek tradition, very important, as probably Tony knows a lot more than I do, those in theology know more than I do, very important for the Christian era, very important as a Neoplatonist, but also important as himself a Stoic. He is Platonized, but also Stoicized, and he has these amazing and copious commentaries on the Bible, including commentaries on Genesis and Exodus, that are really important sources for us for knowing some of what the Greek Stoics knew, because we don't think he directly read the Latin Stoics, so he probably is a pretty honest source for what some of the Greek Stoics knew. So I've been reading him a little bit this week. It's a new learning curve for me, but it's exciting. So I think he's an underrated guy. And I have to say, he's not even listed in one of the old Oxford classical dictionaries. So hopefully he will make it. So the nugget of the book and what I want to talk to you about today is how we can turn to the actual historic Stoics to understand something about military culture, the challenges of those in the military today, and also what Philo has to say about this. And a few just primers about Stoicism. So we're talking about a philosophy in its heyday around 2nd century before the Common Era to 2nd century after, so it follows out Aristotle. in Plato, and it's very much a return to some very severe Socratic and Platonic moves. In particular, it's that what's sufficient for your happiness is virtue, and the virtue is internal and inner. So external goods are not part of your happiness. Aristotle argued that virtue plus external goods were important. For the Stoics, it's just your inner virtue. And so you can have a lot of control over that, the thought is, and so a more permanent and stable, lasting kind of happiness. Second, you should strengthen your virtue as much as you can and leave the externals outside. So strengthen your dominion and let what happens outside you happen. This means they reclassify goods and evils. So conventional goods, the state of your body, the health of your body, whether your homeland is not at war, whether your children are alive and flourishing, whether you have wealth, health, all those things are conventional goods, but they're external goods, and they don't really matter to your happiness. And similarly, the reverse, losing your homeland, being at war, ill health of your body, a great failure in the stock market, or someone stealing your booty, as begins the Iliad, with your war bride being stolen, so your status or honor is diminished, all that really isn't part of your happiness. The archaics got it wrong. And we get it wrong, we populars, or contemporaries, when we think that really matters to us. So they're quite severe. With reclassification of goods and evils, so the genuine good is your virtue, and Philo of Alexandria, himself a very well-educated, wealthy Jew who also went to Caligula to advocate on behalf of the Jews who were suffering a deprivation of rights and being slaughtered. He himself includes amongst the real inner goods divine knowledge of God, the sort of virtue being knowing God's goodness. In addition, there's a corollary about emotions, that you should let go of your emotions, extricate them, root them out, because they're sticky attachments paradigmatically to those external goods. Love of your children, attachment bonds to your children, patriotism, loyalty, grieving over your lost ones in war, getting angry in war and feeling revenge, raging revenge of Iliad sort that Achilles knows so well. He's the angriest, he and Agamemnon, the angriest men alive. All that are not good they're not good combat motivators, they're not good for ethos on the battlefield or anywhere in life, so let them go. So what we're going to ask today, does that mean that the sage who has had this transformation, she's reclassified her goods and evils, and she doesn't have these ordinary emotions, is she Mr. Spock, you know Spock on Star Trek, apathetic? Apathetic comes from the Greek of this time, apatheia, lack of emotions. Are there any emotions? And most Stoics, including an important source, Philo, will say there are these good emotions, eupatheia, good emotions, or fine or rational emotions, characteristic of the sage, and what Philo brings in is they're characteristic of God. God has them paradigmatically. Okay, so for the military, let me proceed as follows. I'll quickly tell you some of the attractions of Stoicism, some of its curses, especially I think for the military, and along the way bring in some Jewish texts, as well as counterpart Greek and Roman texts. By the way, Philo Alexandria, roughly 20 before the Common Era to about 45 Common Era. So he overlapped with Seneca, but we don't think, and they may have met, but it's not clear that he read his works. So what's the attractions of Stoicism for the military? Well, one example of it, and I have a picture in the book, and sometimes I do PowerPoint, and I'm glad I did today because New North was without electricity until just a few minutes ago. James Stockdale, probably known to this audience more as the woeful running mate of Perot, who said, "Why am I here?" and some classic lines like that. A wandering philosopher. He also he's an Annapolis grad aviator, went to Stanford to study international relations and law, found it not his cup of tea, and found philosophy was his thing, and studied the ancients, and as a parting gift, just before he went to Vietnam, he was handed a little book by Epictetus, the Handbook. And I've interviewed him 3 or 4 times. He died this summer, having suffered from Alzheimer's for a while. But he said to me, you know, what do you think an aviator, a martini-drinking, golf-playing aviator needed with a book like this? But he proceeded to memorize it, and having read it every night in his wardroom. And when he was shot down, he became the lead POW in the Hanoi Hilton, 7.5 years there. As he was shot down, he said these very prescient words. This is 007 James Bond Stockdale, is what he called himself. And I'm leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus, maybe 5 years down there. It ended up being 7.5. It became his philosophy. He used it as the head of his chain of command. And an interesting note regarding proselytization on military campuses, in particular Colorado Springs. He said he tried once through their special code to knock it on the wall of someone who had just gone into solitary. He himself had been in solitary for 2.5 years in leg irons, and he said, "Are you okay?" And then he said something about Stoicism, and there was deafening silence on the other side, meaning no knockback. And at that point, he decided, no proselytization. I got my ducks lined up in one way through Stoic tonics. Everyone will work it out for themselves. But he did essentially try to empower himself as best he could by realizing that as deprived as he was, he had more in his power than he could out-trick his captor, Cat Eyes, I believe he was called. He could learn how not to want the cigarette that was dangling before him. He did sit-ups and, about 100 every day, even in leg irons. He bloodied his face and hands so he wouldn't be paraded as propaganda, etc. So, I mean, you get the feel. And many young cadets, midshipmen, and officers read him, read Epictetus. When I interviewed him, I know Epictetus pretty well, but I could not decipher when Epictetus stopped and when Stockdale began. It had become him. He had personalized it or lived in it, occupied the voice. So that's one sense. Epictetus will say something like this: in our power are moral character and all its functions, not in our power are the body, the parts of the body, possessions, parents, brothers, children, country, and friends, and associates in general. So detach from what you can't control. And that's a message in the military. Be all you can be. I think the Army still does that one. An army of one. Most people in the Pentagon think it's the stupidest logo ever, since it's all about camaraderie. And anyone that fights says they fight for each other and to pull and to know and trust that someone will pull you out if you go down. Another phrase from Epictetus, imagine you're in an athletic contest, you're an old guy pitted against a young athlete. You can always strengthen yourself and try to fight back. You don't have to wait for the next Olympics. That's waiting 4 years in order to show your strength. So every day is a day for mastery. What's the curses? And this is what preoccupies me in the book, and it preoccupies me being something of an observer to the military, and I still see this, and an observer now with people coming on. 30% of the military are showing signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, the Surgeon General said. This summer, when 4 months after the first wave of deployments came back, it was at 17%. Everyone says it will go up, and it gets only worse with insurgency because of the unpredictability, the helplessness, and if you ask anyone in the military who is of rank, aside from a few golden few, like just lost his Romeo Dallaire, who's was in charge of the UN in Rwanda, is a general who has founded an important PTSD center in Canada. But most here, the higher you go, the less likely they are to self-refer, and the less likely they are to encourage their troops to seek psychological counseling. It's a career killer, I'm told over and over again. It's not what a macho guy does, and it's poison to them. And yet, there's a fabulous piece in the Wall Street Journal on Thursday of a ranger, 3 deployments, Afghanistan, Iraq. In Afghanistan, saw the worst. He was stranded for 8 hours with 5 buddies dying. He 3 years later, finally resigned and is seeking treatment for post-traumatic severe PTSD. So it's very hard for the military to embrace this. So I am concerned about the myth of being bulletproof, of being bulletproof in mind or body, that Stoicism lends to a lot of officers. And while it's incredibly important for girding yourself, and it's a natural ideology, ethos for a military person, taking it too far can be poison, I think. So it's a kind of promise of hyper-resilience, hyper-detachment. Military, going to war has, as one young officer told me the other day I was interviewing, he says it's unnatural to kill, but you do it, so you numb yourself, he says. You go all numb, and you compartmentalize, but then denumbing when you get home is what's hard, and many find this transition very, very difficult. Law school had an event Thursday night of 5 guys that had just come home. They were first and second year law students. They were speaking. And when I asked, can I interview them, they said, oh, don't interview me, interview my wife. She really knows about what it's like for me to come home and make a transition. So it's tough. So I want to run through where Philo speaks loudest, and that's regarding the body, images of the body, images of grieving, and other kinds of emotions. So what's the contemporary view of the body, the military body? The contemporary view of the military body is that it's, well, we idealize it. Bethesda, the Y, you can join the fitness corps program, you can have your own drill sergeant without signing up. You can go in for boot camp at 5:30 in the morning in order to get fit and tough. You can have a Marine officer pushing you around on some park ground. My husband did it one morning in Bethesda, one season in Bethesda. But there's this paradox, of course, that the military who are most able also will come home, often the most disabled. And there's a public investment at the front end, in the war machine, but not so easily at the tail end. And so we're squeamish about the maimed body, the disabled body. Again, with PowerPoints, the book has images of prosthetics, of wheelchairs. And the military itself is squeamish about how to reintegrate the injured back into society. So someone like Epictetus has a solution, and Philo too. The body's not really yours. You dissociate from it because it's a contingent good. It's not the real you. It's not critical for your happiness. It's an indifferent, as they'll say. Something that's an indifferent, that doesn't make a difference to your happiness. And so, I don't have this in your handout, but this is Epictetus on the body. Is your body then poor, enslaved, or free? It's enslaved. Do you know that it's a slave to fever, gout, eye disease, dysentery, to a tyrant, of fire and steel, to everything that's stronger than itself? Yep, it's a slave. How then can anything belonging to the body be unhindered? As a result, you ought to treat your entire body like an overburdened ass, as long as it's yours and allowed to you. And of all the things that it goes toward, sex, food, drink, they're just more burdens. They're bridles, pack saddles, shoes, barley, fodder for the ass. Let go of these too. Dismiss them more quickly and more cheerfully than the little ass itself. So very different than Freud, the bodily ego. Body ego is Freud's notion that you identify with your body, that your body's shape and form is part of who you are, and your moral development includes kind of growing into your body. So what does Philo have to say about this? Note how similar his message is. Again, I was saving space on handouts, so I'll come to some of those on paper yet soon. But this is let me tell you a little bit about his style. So he has all these exegesis, midrash, but mostly in a Greek style rather than a Talmudic style. And he has what's called allegorical exegesis, where he interprets, he almost explains away the literal meaning and then interprets it with a metaphysical, largely Stoic or Platonic meaning. So in commenting on a passage from Genesis 17, verse 10, and he comments it on it in a book called Questions and Answers on Genesis that got translated from Greek into Armenian, like Greek, and then back into, I don't actually think it came back into Greek. It was translated by a guy, Ralph Marcus, from Armenian into English as part of the lobe, one of the few lobes you'll see without facing pages, Greek English. And this is, and not that reliable translation, but I rely on it here, not knowing Armenian. The mind which is endowed with virtue is a sojourner in the corporeal space allotted to it. The body is always only a servant and attendant of a being who is free. And the Genesis passage is this: what's the meaning of, asks Philo, I will give this land to thee, and to thy seed after thee, in which you have sojourned, mainly all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. So he fastens on the everlasting. And it's not that it will be your body that you yourself inherits it, but somehow you really are not anything to do with your body. That's just a servant. So similar to the Epictetus message. More interestingly, lots of discussion in all of Philo about circumcision, because it was a very questioned practice in his time. And so, again, he asks, what is the meaning of this passage from Genesis? And every male of you shall be circumcised. To Abraham, it is said. Philo answers, since that which is masculine in us is the intellect, prune away and cast away anything that's superfluous and all the superfluous shoots. It's very Platonic, like the Phaedo, the body's the prison house of the soul. Get rid of it. Here's an example. Get rid of any necessary skin. He says, have it cut away and removed from you. I say, any extra bit that might cause pride, he goes on, or excessive desire. So at heart is this Stoic teaching that you extirpate desire, you prune away anger, fear, grief, all the ordinary desires, anything that would attach to an object that you could get a sticky investment in. And pruning the male organ is as good a place to start as anywhere, that 8 days. And discussions, the Egyptians do it later, the Essenes were doing it at certain periods, etc. So what about grieving? Now in the military, permission to grieve is controversial. I was at Fort Rucker last month, and there were some, these are they don't say helo's a naval term, chopper pilots. And they say you would never grieve openly in front of your troops, but you might grieve privately or just with your little immediate group of senior officers, but you don't show tears. This is a very Roman decorum notion that you don't shed a tear except the one that you just can't possibly control. Coriolanus, Shakespeare's great Stoic character in the play by that name, says, it is no small thing for my eyes to shed tears of compassion. Took him a lot to be able to show a tear. Now this was, I'll give you Seneca in a moment, but remember, this is not always the case in the ancient world. I want to now finally look at the handout. So recall the Iliad. The Iliad's filled with rage, wrath, combat anger as a motivator, revenge, and tears over loss. So Achilles has just lost Patroclus, his beloved buddy, whether a homosexual or bond or just a comrade in arms, a beloved comrade in arms, of the tightest sort of connection. And I think it's one of the first instances of survivor guilt in our literature, because he says, Achilles goes on to say after he loses Patroclus, remember, Patroclus is wearing Achilles' armor. he goes out and does the battle for Achilles. So Hector probably thought it was Achilles. He's wearing Achilles' armor, and then Achilles finds him dead, and he says, I can't go on, there's no way. It should have been me rather than you. So this great switch in costume and of lives. And the women, he and Patroclus, carried off as captives, caught the grief in their hearts, and keened and wailed. It's usually women who keened in the ancient world, but not only. Out of the tents they ran to ring the great Achilles. All of them beat their breasts with clenched fists, sank to the ground. Each woman's knees gave way. Antilochus, kneeling near, weeping uncontrollably, clutched Achilles' hands as he wept his proud heart out, for fear he'd slash his throat with an iron blade. Achilles suddenly loosed a terrible, wrenching cry, and his noble mother heard him, and she cried out in turn. And then a little later, this is the Fagles translation, Priam wept freely for man-killing Hector. This is his enemy's father, throbbing, crouching before Achilles' feet, as Achilles wept himself, now for his father, now for Patroclus once again. The enemies, Troy and Greece, sobbing in each other's arms, and their sobbing rose and fell throughout the house. So the archaic heroes cry like babies in the Iliad. Lamentations. So this is, as you know, we think in reference to the Babylonian exile, the fall of the temple, around 586 before the Common Era. And I'm reading from the Jewish Study Bible. Alas, lonely sits the city, Jerusalem, once great with people. She that was great among nations is become like a widow. She's compared to a woman. The princess among states is become a thrall, a slave. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. And again, in Lamentations, it's 5 poems, very different voices that are collected together. And constant is this refrain throughout the verses. She has no one to comfort her. My eyes shall flow without cease. And then commands to grieve. Shed tears like a torrent, cry out in the night, pour out your heart like water. So there's this command to grieve for the fallen city, and very palpable and raw images of orphans, of the civilians that are killed in war and in a siege, of children not having any mother from whom to suckle, and who is going to hear the children's wailing. So very raw. But then you get to Seneca and Philo, and you move from, well, I don't know, Homer is around 10th century Common Era, around the time of David, maybe, roughly, or King David. And, and then you get to Common Era, first century or so, and you get to Seneca, and I think I have a passage there. For Seneca, it's okay just if you keep it nipped. Maybe a little tear will fall, but you should never weep keen. That's histrionic, that's hysterical, that's women's hysteria and women's cheap stuff. And it's feigned. And so you should be able to control all but that first glistening tear. So he says, but suppose if I forbade you to show emotion, there are certain feelings which claim their own rights. Tears fall, and by being shed, they ease the soul. What then shall we do? Let us allow them to fall, but let us not command them to do so. Let us weep according as emotion floods our eyes, but not as much as mere imitation shall demand. So the idea is that you can control it, and when it gets to the point where you could say, no, I will not have it, that's when you have to exercise your will and agency. And indeed, a little footnote here, in this crash course on Stoicism, the Stoics think that emotions, proper emotions, are voluntary, that you assent to a certain impression, a certain cognition. Yes, that is frightening. Yes, that is a loss. And that assent becomes an opinion, and the emotion is a cognition or opinion. So they, along with Aristotle, are our first cognitive psychologists of the emotions. That is the raging view. Our colleagues here, in particular, Jerry Parrott is a very esteemed cognitive psychologist of the emotions. And it goes back to the Stoics and Aristotle. Okay, now what about Philo? Again, writing roughly the same time as Seneca. He gives us quasi-permission to grieve, and let me just footnote. So the Stoics have this very improbable view that emotions are cognitive, they're within your responsibility, you can control them. But then they're always asked. So this guy Alice Gellius, a 2nd century, somewhat dubious reporter, journalistic kind of philosopher, in Attic Nights, he says, I was on the ship, and this questioner comes up to a friend of mine who was a Stoic philosopher, and he says, I noticed when it got really turbulent and the ship looked like it was going to go under, you Stoic philosopher started to turn green, and you got jittery. I thought a Stoic wasn't supposed to be afraid. I thought he wasn't supposed to have any fear. I thought he was extirpating that, pruning it away, cutting it away like grief and sexual desires and everything else. And so later on, the Stoic philosopher doesn't give this questioner the time of day, but later on he gives the time of day to Gellius, and he says, here's how it goes. The real sage can have an involuntary expression of emotion. He can get jittery, his face can go pale, he may turn green, but it's only involuntary, so he's not really responsible for it. If he says, yes, I'll have it, indulges it, then it's a real emotion, but the real sage will never have that. Footnote to this, Augustine was, I've been told by Richard Sirachi, an ancient philosopher at Cambridge who works on these texts right through the Christian period, got something wrong here in his Gellius translation. He took jittery to mean he can show jitters. He took that to mean a voluntary thing, and he then moved it on to erections, which always to this point in the Greek world were involuntary, from Aristotle on, and the De Motu Animalium, on Wishes of Animals. And Augustine got stuck with the problem that erections are voluntary, and so it became sinful and part of his responsibility. Sort of an aside in bad transmission. But for the Stoic period, you can kind of show, your hair can stand on end, you can turn green, you can get jittery. There's a contemporary neurobiologist of the emotions, Joseph Ledoux, the emotional brain. He calls these low-road emotions. They go right to the limbic system, and they avoid the cortical material. That's how he maps it. Well, how does Philo deal with this? This is a source for us that he knew about this Greek view of what they call proto-emotions, or proto-they, pre-emotions, not the real thing, involuntary phenomena, startle reflexes, we might call them. So Philo, he's dealing with a passage in Genesis. The passage is one in which Abraham appears to grieve over the death of Sarah in Genesis 23:2-3. In one translation, and my Hebrew's not good enough to know how good this translation is, so please forgive me. Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. So what does Philo capture on, being a good Stoic exegeticist? Proceed to wail. He doesn't really wail, he only proceeds to wail. And he says in his questions, you think just Talmudists that, give you a song and dance about drashes on things. Philo, a good Hellenic exegete, does it too. But excellently and carefully does Scripture show that the virtuous man did not resort to wailing or mourning. Abraham, for him, like Moses, is sage. He's in the image of God. Doesn't resort to wailing or mourning, but only came there for such a thing. For things that unexpectedly and against his will strike the pusillanimous man, the cowardly man, weaken, crush, and overthrow him. Whereas everywhere they merely bow down. They just sort of cause to shake a little bit. The man of constancy when they direct their blows against him, and not in such a way as to bring their work to completion, since reason repels them. Reason says no, it resists the urge. So if Abraham had actually grieved, then he wouldn't have had real sage. He wouldn't be a sage because he'd indulge his emotions. He only has the pre-emotion, the proto-emotion. And then he adds a little lesson to the moral learner, which I like quite a lot. And so it's not fitting for a man devoted to moral excellence to stand fixed in prayer when something happens against his will, or to be entirely rapt and moved and drawn toward this. But he should be cautious, gradually go toward it, and retire before the end is reached. So, if you feel like you're going to be overcome by a passion of grief, of fear, of revenge, check it, hold it, resist it. Don't give as an excuse that you were paralyzed in prayer. He says that's not good enough. You could get out of your trance in prayer and resist. So you can always intervene in that moment before you have a real full-blown emotional experience. This I often think of, those of you familiar with psychoanalytic tradition, of countertransference. So you're the analyst, and I've written a paper called the sage analyst. You're the analyst, you're listening to someone tell something, and all of a sudden it reminds you of something that was very emotionally charged for you. And you don't really have the full-blown emotion if you're good at an analyst, because after all, they're there to have you treat them and not them treat you. But you might have a little, you notice so that you do this, or you start playing with your glasses like that. Or you scratch your head, or you do something that's a little tweak of the emotion, but then you regain control. You hover evenly over the ego, Anna Freud would say, you listen with equanimity. So you regain your composure. That's what's going on in these texts. Excuse me. Okay, and then there's another passage I want to read to you, because it's sort of to do with the holidays now. What about laughter? So there are these passages. Abraham laughed when he, a centenarian, was told that he would give birth to a child. And similarly, Sarah laughed. How could I, so old, give birth to a child? How does Philo deal with these? Because Abraham and Sarah are supposed to, again, be sages for him. They shouldn't be laughing with ordinary emotions. So he has two nifty devices. One is it's a pre-emotion. Again, it just sort of involuntary outburst. And then another one that, again, shows us that he's really reading Greek texts here. The sage isn't only subject to these little involuntary outbursts. The sage also can have almost divine emotions, like divine joy. Chara is the Greek. Charity, or emotion, charity comes from that, C-H-A-R-A. He can have well-reasoned, tranquil emotions that are recalibrated toward real good and evil and not conventional good and evil. And so there's a kosher version, if you will, of all the ordinary emotions. And that's how Philo deals with Abraham and Sarah having laughed. So I'll give you the passage. This one's found in Philo's on Abraham. This laughter is not understood to be the laughter of the body, which is frequent in childish sport, but it's the result of a settled happiness and rejoicing of the mind, like God would experience. This kind of laughter, the wise man is appropriately said to offer. This was not, here I'm sorry, the reference isn't to Abraham and Sarah laughed, but this has to do with when Isaac is sacrificed and Isaac's name having to capture laughter. So the man is appropriately said to offer a sacrifice to God, showing thus by a figure that by allegory, to rejoice does properly belong to God alone. For the human race, now here's the ordinary emotions. The human race is subject to sorrow and fear from evils which are present or expected, so that men and women are either grieved at unexpected evils pressing upon them, or kept in suspense and disquietude and fear with respect to those which are impending. So all of those are the ordinary emotions we all suffer from, that are present in Homer, that most military people and ordinary people will feel. But the sage and God are exempt from those ordinary emotions, from fear, and enjoy an immunity from every kind of suffering. And hence, only God and the sage have true happiness or blessedness. So a very Stoic reading of the Bible on that. Okay, now, what do we say to this? And I'll sort of conclude with this. Well, my lesson in the book is while I sympathize, and we all aspire to more rather than less control, to be a control freak is dangerous. It involves a detachment and denial from things that are important to us, that should rightly remain important to us. Our children, the welfare of our body, the health of my body, the fact that I may become a triple amputee after war and now have to deal with that, should be a source of grief, of loss. It doesn't mean that it can cripple you emotionally. Maybe there are ways to overcome it. But trauma is not necessarily a pathology in the face of overwhelming circumstances that life can deal you. And so Cicero, I think, is very reasonable on this one. And I think he's a sane voice here. Very quickly, he says, he lost his daughter at childbirth, Tullia. He says, I tried all these Stoic constellations. I tried to pretend that I knew when I gave birth to her that she was a mere mortal. This is a line repeated throughout the Stoics, and then it's picked up from the pre-Socratic Anaxagoras. And he says, I'm sorry it doesn't work. He says, it's not within our power to forget or gloss over circumstances which we believe to be evil at the very moment they're piercing us. They tear at us, buffet us, goad us, scorch us, stifle us. And you tell us to forget about them? Pretty pointed criticism of Stoicism. In the book, in talking about this, I came across, I tried to read Beyond Easels here. I don't know if anyone really, if you've been able to read cover to cover Kaddish, let me know. But you pick and poke through it, and there was something very interesting in Kaddish that I found. And this was a prayer from a Hasidic rabbi who had military matters on his mind. And this is the prayer, the commentary on this 19th century Hasidic rabbi. And I'll preface it, it's not clear that the Kaddish really allows you to grieve full out. Holy, sanctified, but it doesn't ever say anything about the dead person, about loss. It just says, make holy and continue to magnify God's judgment. God's judgment presumably being the particular judgment that this life has ended. So in thinking about this, I thought, okay, is the Kaddish Stoic in this regard? I mean, is it not upfront about loss? Does it give permission to grieve? And so I came across this Hasidic rabbi saying, and this is, I believe, on your handout. The saying of Rabbi Bunam of Prazucha about the reason for the mourner's Kaddish is well known. In the ordinary world, when a small unit of a large army is lost, the loss is not felt. This is terribly prescient for our current world. And it is not until an entire division is missing that the depletion must be corrected and the army must be reinforced. It's otherwise, however, in the army of God. If only a single Jew is missing, a single person we might say, then there is already a lack in the greatness and the holiness of God. Therefore we pray that his name may be magnified and sanctified. That is, that his blessed name may be made complete for what it has lost with the disappearance of the deceased. Because it isn't complete now, and it must be made more complete. I found this an amazing quote that shows up what I've always sensed as a limit in the Kaddish, but didn't quite put my finger on it. All right, so I just want to end with on one other note from the Bible that's not Hellenic or Stoicizing in the way that last passage from the rabbi in the 19th century is not Stoic. And that is from Exodus 30, 11, 16, and Numbers 31, 50. And I owe noting these texts debt to a rabbi in town named Arnie Resnikoff, who is a naval chaplain, a retired naval chaplain, who was Wesley Clark's chaplain in Kosovo, and actually was sent recently to Colorado Springs to try to deal with the problem there of proselytization. And he said, have a look at 30:11:16 and Numbers 31:50. So I looked, and sure enough, there we learn in Exodus that each soldier goes to war and he has to pay a half shekel for ransom on his soul. And that when he comes home, he has to ask for expiation. And my current work, a new book that I'm working on, is about this transition in and out of war. That in the most just war, with the most just conduct on a soldier's part, soldiers still come home broken. They come home anguished that they killed, even if they killed justly and even if they killed for a just cause. So, and as one kid said, he's 25 years old, he has a metal plate in his head, he spent 9 months in Walter Reed, and he looks amazing. He said, I came home believing, I did the unnatural. Whatever I did, it was right, but it was the unnatural. And that sentiment in the Bible, I think, expresses it. So the transition to war and out of war is what we all have to think about, and it's not easy, and these passages make it very clear, and the rising rate of post-traumatic stress disorder makes it clear. And so I want to just end, Seneca says, last words in his treatise on anger, let us cultivate humanity. And I think it's a paradox for those who go to war, because soldiers need to numb their human sentiments in the midst of war, and they do. That's the way the body works. But as soon as it's over, they have to recover their human sentiments, and that's very hard to do, having numbed them so well to do war's deeds. So, I'm not sure Philo fully gets it in his Stoic interpretation, but the Bible itself does. So perhaps we might say that even the most stoic armor is never fully bulletproof. Thank you.
I wonder if I might use the prerogative of the chair to ask the first question. And to try to challenge you on an important assumption in this, which is that because war is unnatural, that there is quite a large propensity to, how we phrase it, either post-traumatic stress syndrome, or you can phrase it in more classical words or words of antiquity. However, let me ask whether there is some risk of overstating that phenomenon, and citing three bodies of evidence. One, right after 9/11, there was a lot of talk about how important it was to get all kinds of psychologists and psychiatrists to be available for people who were there in New York that day and would have post-traumatic stress syndrome. And it turned out that was evidently grossly overstated, that in fact there wasn't the kind of massive evidence of it. Second, in World War II, by the end of the war, at the end of the war, there were 12 million Americans under arms. Now, obviously not all of them were combat veterans, many of them weren't, but the American history of the last 60 years is that the veterans came home, got educated, made families, and so forth. And I wonder if there is some tendency through the helping professions and other things to perhaps overstate more than exists the degree of stress. Lastly, Israel is a society in which all able-bodied men, or virtually all able-bodied men, except the ultra-Orthodox, serve in the military, both reserve units, and many of them who have perfectly everyday, ordinary lives, nonetheless, are from time to time pitched into situations that involve combat. Now, I'm not saying that post-traumatic stress syndrome and reactions to terrible things don't happen, but I wonder if there isn't a tendency in the analysis to perhaps overstate the phenomenon.
Good, thank you. First of all, the phenomenon is ancient, the name is new. In 1971, 1973, it got registered in the Diagnostic Statistics Manual. With the confluence of the Vietnam vets coming home and women, this is very fascinating, women showing signs that were, women who had been raped showing signs very similar to what the Vietnam vets were experiencing. So this, and Judith Herman wrote this classic book on, what is the name of this book? Something with trauma in the title, bringing historically these two phenomena together. The syndrome, irrespective of those three bits of evidence, it's a syndrome, most say, like being overweight with a more and a less. And numbers were never available in World War II. World War II is very different than Vietnam. People came home to ticker tape parades and the like, as opposed to eggs being thrown in their face in a very unpopular war. And those that have studied this phenomenon, I've done a lot of chatting with a guy named Matthew Friedman, who's the head of the PTSD Center, which is in White River Junction at the Vets Hospital up there. Helplessness and lack of a sense of agency, as well as surprise, are factors that tend to exacerbate the likeliness for you to have, as well as pre-existing conditions. You know, people, they need to do very good studies of who goes in and who goes out. So his prediction, and this is showing up, is that those who are in an insurgency are much more likely to be vulnerable to stress disorder than those who are in conventional war. And they're showing right now, a lot of those that are showing signs of stress are those in these motorcades, or not motorcades, but you know, combat vehicles, where they don't have proper armament and they are very exposed to roadside bombs. Secondly, many in World War II did very well, and the circumstances were different, but many still suffered. And this is anecdotal, I don't have the statistics, but one of the more moving experiences for me in researching this book was talking to my uncle, who's a 83 now, 84 Okinawa veteran, Marine. At bayonet for 48 hours, they were put on speed. The 50th anniversary to the date of the Hill battle, he had recurrent nightmares and relived the time sequence. And he's an interesting case, because I can't imagine that he didn't go in with some kind of rage issue, but he suffers deeply from it, and only with the VA really being geared up for this post-Vietnam was he able to seek help. Another factor in this that I want to just make public, I've been talking to a lot of Vietnam veterans, and I've gone to some, there's been a wonderful play that I took part of my class to in Alexandria called Sandstorm, written by a veteran who just came back, a Marine veteran. Vietnam vets are starting to go back to the VA hospital. And in fact, the VA hospital, and I talked to people on the Senate Arms, the arms committee that have to do with the VA, is overrun now, not just by returning folks from Iraq, but because of Vietnam vets who are feeling their symptoms as they watch. So it's a syndrome. It's not a on or off kind of thing, or a yes or no. And my dad in World War II had an advantage that many in the Vietnam War didn't have, and which some who write about this period said was very ameliorative to helping deal with grieving. And that was, he came home on the QE-1. He was a medic on board QE-1, 5,000 of them. It took 2 to 3 weeks. It was a butcher shop. It was horrific. But he did come home on a commercial airline solo, which is how these guys came home from Vietnam, and some of them to this day from Iraq. So much more things that I don't want to go on, but I think it's a syndrome, and I think just one thing about Israel, it's something I'd like to study. I'd love to hear a little bit more about it. I do know, I was talking about this recently, and someone who's a retired lieutenant colonel from Israel came out to me and she said, there's a phenomenon in Israel that I don't like at all, and that is I went to my nephew's funeral who died in war, and some of the Israelis are saying you shouldn't grieve at a military funeral. And Israeli as well as Palestinian parents are trying to combat that trend, if it even is a trend. So, okay, so I rambled. Mike, should I be the MC?
Yeah, go ahead. So it's a fascinating talk. It was
Thank you.
many ramifications all over the place. One little factual correction, one of the things you said, and then a question. In all this applies to your new project as well, in all the talk about Vietnam vets being spat at when they returned, and you said eggs being thrown at them, the only little studies I've seen of that, actually by historians, sociologists, veterans themselves, tried to document one case of that happening and could not document it.
And I get this from Marine colonels who spoke to me themselves.
Yeah, well, you should read this book. It's called The Spitting Image.
Oh,
it's by Vietnam vet. I'll quote it.
Yeah.
But anyway, a guy named Jerry Lemke. and it sort of became an urban legend.
Yeah,
People usually talk about they knew people who it happened to. But anyway, that's an aside. The question is sort of a cross-cultural question. That is, to some degree, I don't know very much about Zen and Bushido and that tradition, or for that matter about the tradition of right now, suicide bombers and the kind of training they get. But I would assume that they have their own texts and their own ways of getting to this. I mean, to what degree, in other words, is this a sort of effective warrior's code to steel people to not just be able to go into war and kill themselves, but also to be able to grieve some and yet see that grief in a larger perspective and therefore not lose control?
Right. It's an amazing instrument, and it is used in that way, though it hasn't always been. So part of my pointing to the Iliad, and I look at it pretty closely in the book, is that in that archaic tradition, revving up rage in your belly, think of Plato, there's a word thumos, means warrior spirit, and it's a part of the soul, it's the middle part of the soul, it's what the guardians of the city have in order to do their work. And so the more revved up and kind of let loose that anger, revenge rage, you might say, which some soldiers say they use too to rev up for war. So maybe one way to answer, some would say, yeah, Stoic on everything except the anger side, because anger is, traditional warrior stuff. Although it is a very useful way to gird your loins. If you listen to folks unschooled in Stoicism, just hearing in my mind's voice right now, this young 25-year-old said to me last week, I detached, I compartmentalized, I dissociated. Those are his words. So, to be able to do what I had to do. And surely there's also a macho culture that goes with not showing your emotions. That's part of this culture. I don't know enough about anthropological other areas, and certainly with suicide bombers, there's a lot of, I presume, with the afterworld and eschatology that I'm not referring to here. Yes?
I was thinking as you were speaking that even the biblical record is really a mixed one, isn't it? You have the quotation of Abraham weeping for Sarah, and I'm thinking of David with Jonathan.
Yes,
even with
Samuel
Saul,
1
you
or
have
Samuel 2.
tremendous weeping. Yeah. In a way, you have both in the scriptural record.
Thank you. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I certainly have never seen in my passing knowledge of commentary, which is not great, as Hellenic or as Stoic a kind of touch as Philo gives us. But those are interesting bits and pieces. Yes, Jason. Hi.
Wonderful talk.
Thank you so much.
The new book by Joan Didion, The Year of Magical Thinking, about her husband's death, and about how she said she was insane the night that it happened. And that the social worker, she said when she saw the social worker, she knew it was all over, and the social worker said about her, don't worry, she's a cool customer. And I'm just wondering, this notion of people saying she's a cool customer, or saying to a person who's grieving, I can't believe how well you're done, there's another downside to the Stoicism, because it's easier for people around the one grieving. They're sort of giving a cue to the person by saying, I can't believe how wonderfully you're holding up. It's sort of orders to keep holding up that way. To say a cool customer means you don't need attention. That we give signals to people who are friends of ours who are terminally ill. We think we're boosting them with words of encouragement, we're congratulating them on their bravery. But what we're also doing is we're giving them cues that this is how we want them to keep acting. It's a kind of, so it's easier for the person around the sufferer if the person is stoic. It's much easier, and it's a negative too. We're complicit in that.
Yes, that's very interesting, and I haven't read the book, but I did read the piece in the New York Times magazine section. I'm also thinking there's a lot of studies on boys. It was the name, I cite them in the book. Raising Cain is one of them, and then there's a guy named Pollack, I believe, at Harvard. All these studies that boys get selectively trained in a similar way. It's okay. The palette of emotions is narrow. Anger is the one that's okay and expected, but grief, tears, are sissy stuff, all that kind of thing. the roots are very old. I always think in my mind of is it the Apology of Phaedo? Plato says, oh, don't bring in the women when I die because they'll be crying too much. So the hysterics of a woman kind of get on. Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's easier for those around them. Mm-hmm. Yes. No.
I'm interested in the resonance of Stoicism today, and if we take the Israeli army example, I'm curious, this is sort of along the lines of the military code. Can the part about controlling revenge be used, or is it being used culturally? In other words, there are aspects of this that I'd like to see have some resonance towards peace negotiations, perhaps. So what is the culture of this now?
I'm not a great cultural or professional cultural observer. I'm just an armchair cultural observer. Two things I'll say, and one is philosophically, conceptually, I have trouble knowing exactly what the line is between revenge and which is problematic, and its twin cousin, which I think is okay, righteous indignation, the moral protest, the moral outrage. And that's in part why I didn't talk about this. I have been studying for 3 or 4 years now with a guy named Max Tickton, who's an emeritus rabbi in the area. I actually had a bat mitzvah with him 4 or 5 years ago, having only been allowed to be confirmed in my synagogue years and years ago. Anyway, I was at synagogue with him the other day and said, I think I'm going to do something on anger. And Stoicism said, oh, don't go down the anger. And he meant, the Bible's so full of it, where do you begin? But I don't know the real difference. It's something I'm thinking about. Cheap answers about vindictiveness and and the public law isn't on your side, and it's not equitable punishment when it's revenge, and all the opposite when it's moral outrage. Just don't do it for me. So I'm not quite sure what the difference is. I have, though, spoken to a lot of military folks who says, no, we don't rev up our troops with revenge. Maybe they enlisted out of revenge post 9/11, but that's not the way we rev up. And I had a very serious discussion, I was in South Africa this summer, with an Israeli philosopher, wish I could remember his name right now, who is at Haifa, who's at Tel Aviv, I think. And he said, and he's written the code of ethics for the military. Like Asa Kashir, exactly. And when he heard me say something, he said, we do not bully. Israeli soldiers do not bully their subordinates. They may bully, revenge may go outward, but and I said, well, that's because, maybe that's the homogeneity issue there. And he's, no, it's because we don't want them transmitting bullying, displacing it onto others afterwards. Think of Full Metal Jacket. I give that quote in here. You maggots, good night, you ladies. The horrible, that Stanley Kubrick vignette. So I don't know. So 2 things. I'd like to be clear conceptually about what the difference is, what the ugliness of revenge that isn't there in moral outrage. Because I think moral outrage and indignation and resentment are critical tools for justice. And then secondly, just what the motivation works. Many soldiers tell me they'll listen to music before they go out for a sortie. Maybe the first time the commander will kind of rev them up with anger, but then everyone knows the drill and they get into that zone by themselves. Yes?
Obviously, there's a very thin line between controlling emotions and repressing them. How do the Stoics deal with that? And if there is some repression in the emotions, how do they deal with dreams?
Good question. I'm trying to think, do I know Stoic texts on dreams? I can tell you where it is in Plato, I can tell you where it is in Aristotle, and I can tell you where it is in Philo, but I'm not sure I know where it is. So that, I have to think a bit about that one. The line between repression the line between control and repression, you're right, is absolutely thin. And in my view, as I say at various places, especially on anger, where I'm looking at Seneca's classic essay on anger, Seneca draws it in the wrong place. It's all about it's what we would call dissociation. It's not you, it's someone else. And he uses all these military metaphors. Build up the wall, make it foolproof. No enemy no foe can come in. So my read on Freud is that for Freud, conflict and ambivalence weren't the problem, but the problem was how you dealt with them. If you embrace them or you figure out ways to own it, it's okay. If you spend your life, like the rat man did, trying to get away from the hatred toward my father or love mistress or whatever, then you're really in for trouble. So I don't think the Stoics got there. But Seneca realizes that if you're too Stoic, it doesn't work. And that's why I find your salvation here, if you like. Because he's always saying, I'm the doctor. The Stoics call themselves doctors, purging the diseases of the soul. I am the doctor as well as the patient. I too grieved for a lost friend. Maybe a few tears were okay. There's constant recanting on the orthodox position. And I think it's in that, more moderate voice that you get some reasonableness.
I'm interested in your sources for your research. I gather you've done a lot of interviews as well as consulted philosophical texts and religious texts. You dropped cinematography a couple times, motion pictures. And I was wondering whether or not you actually looked at motion pictures to try to plumb from them emotions from the troops. I grew up in the era of Roddy Murphy and John Wayne and the macho men of war, and then Oliver Stone came along and Stanley Kubrick. And now there's a movie, and now that's a scene which is going to be...
Jarhead?
Yes.
I teach, it's interesting, my students, I teach one of these big intro ethics classes, about 250 kids, and I used to hand out little excerpts from Jarhead. And I'm going to go have them see it if it opens before Christmas. I'm not sure when it opens. Jarhead was really interesting to me, although some say it's somewhat fabricated. There are reviews online that are
Can you explain what that is for a lot of people that don't know what it is?
Oh, I'm sorry. Jarhead is a book by Anthony Swofford. He was a grunt, Marine grunt in the Persian Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And he has this real writing penchant. I think he went to Iowa, University of Iowa. Is that where the famous writing school is? And he wrote this thing. And I read it last year, and I was teaching a course at law school with David Lupon on war, and we had the kids read the whole thing, and they loved it.
The movie's coming out next week.
And there's a movie coming out, and who's in it? Tom Hanks or...
It's big.
It's a big box office thing. And I found it so revealing because it's so yes, I actually quote a lot of Jarhead in here. I found it revealing because it's from the grunt's perspective, and does what he can to protest unjust orders at times. He also tells you about the anger that comes from boredom. A lot of anger for military troops is from fatigue and boredom, and looking for action and waiting for Charlie Company. Mila is a good example of that. So some of it, it's very eclectic. Traditionally, I've only used ancient texts, or maybe I'll get into the Enlightenment because I study Kant. But in this, I wanted to hear voices of people that were that had seen battle. My father, my mother's experience during the war. So, and that was some of the more moving things. I also, like getting testimony. I want to hear from people while they're still alive.
Also talk about Private Ryan.
Yes, a little bit. Yes.
Do I read Stoicism correctly if I were to think that it's an enormous advantage to a military if its soldiers are, the more stoic they are? I think maybe the ultimate example are the suicide bombers. The body is nothing. It's all about we make jokes about the 72 virgins, but basically the body is nothing. It's all about the afterlife. You
do read something. The Stoics are kind of tricky on the afterlife. So without getting into the metaphysics, we are one part of the cosmos, and the cosmos is Zeus, and it's divine, and there's some fabulous bits. The Stoics and the Cynics, really before them, give us the word cosmopolitanism. We're citizen of the universe, cosmopolites. And we're all together citizens of the universe because we're all children. Epictetus says children of God. We're all some sub-part of a larger part. And if the body isn't indifferent, then it's not the real thing with which you identify. To then go to talk about afterlife is yet something else. But so it may, I'm not preaching a tonic for people to take with them when they go to war, but what I am suggesting is that, and I think you put your finger on it, too much the body goes into a certain kind of narrow vision when you're actually in stress situations in combat. It's not a permanent solution. It's a survival mechanism, and the Stoics didn't know that, but it is. But to make it a permanent solution, and to suggest that all the goods that we commonly cherish are banal, are not real things, to me is not the doctrine. I'm an Aristotelian. It's virtue plus external goods, or what I think makes for happiness. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
This is sort of an interesting remembrance down memory lane. During Watergate, I was struck when Nixon was quoted as going, sort of supporting what was going on because the president can't be seen as having dirtied his fingers with this and that. With art imitating life in the West Wing, President, what's his name? His minister comes in to the Oval Office, who's his old minister, and says, "Can I call you John or whatever, or do I need the formality?" And the president, the character of the president, says, "Actually, when I'm in this office, I would prefer that you call me Mr. President because of the responsibility that I hold here." Almost sort of what you were talking about. It's not me, it's this other person. I just wondered if you ever thought of looking at Stoicism in the executive branch or at that kind of leadership level?
No, but you point to something I am thinking about, and that is the notion of role responsibility. In the philosophical tradition, people always point to Bradley, an idealist, 19th century, but Cicero had it. He said we have 4 different personae we put on. And I think the tricky bit that I'm been singing around the edges here is that putting on the role of soldier is not easy to reconcile with the role of peacetime citizen. I'm not saying it's irreconcilable. I don't mean that at all. I'm not a pacifist. I just mean that what we focused on, in response to your question, are the psychological costs. We haven't really figured out what the moral conflicts are and what the nature of the moral soul of a soldier is. So that's the next bit.
Please join me in thanking Nancy.